I've made this video before, but since the last time I've made it, three things have happened. Sony's released their new 35mm f1.8, Sigma's released their new 35mm f1.2, and the 35mm f1.4 art lens has got a firmware upgrade. And so it's time to reevaluate which 35mm lens I'd recommend today. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. So I'm a big fan of 35mm. I probably use it more than any other focal length, and right now my current reigning champ for the Sony E-mount is the 35mm 1.4 art. Now I'm not going to cover everything that I did in the previous videos, but I will give you some rapid fire rationale as to how I got here. Before these recent releases, the contenders were the Sony 35mm f2.8, which is $800 for a lens 2 stops slower than the competition and dealing with the limitations of a semi-pancake build. It's a decent lens, but not a great value in my opinion. And then you have the Samyang or Rokinon 35 1.4, which is a good value lens, coming in cheaper than the 2.8 or even the Sigma 1.4. But there are some slight issues with that lens when it comes to flare, chromatic aberration, corner sharpness, or even build quality, which the Sigma 1.4 handles quite a bit better for not that much more money, at the cost of just slightly worse autofocus performance. And finally, the Sony Zeiss Distagon 1.4, which solves many of those problems, but unfortunately suffers from bad quality control because of the 3 copies of that lens that I tested. All of them had bad decentering issues, which is not acceptable for $1,600. So after careful consideration, I went with the Sigma 35mm 1.4 as sort of a best compromise between features and values. And I was willing to deal with the worse autofocus performance because it wasn't really much of an issue in photos, and I didn't do a lot of continuous autofocus for video. And I've been using it since then, and I've been happy with my choice. Now, some people mentioned in the comments that they opted against the Sigma 1.4 in favor of one of the other 1.4s due to the Sigma's size and weight. And this is a misconception as well as a mistake in my opinion. You should be aware that both the Samyang 1.4 and the Zeiss 1.4 are pretty much identical in terms of size and weight to the Sigma 1.4 and should not be a factor in your decision making. The only lens that actually is smaller and lighter is the f2.8, but again at the cost of 2 stops. But that's all changed now since Sony has released their f1.8, which is a lens that we've sort of been discussing ever since that original video. I remember your comments saying, why can't they just make a lens like the 85 1.8, a lens that we all love, but for 35mm? Well, they finally did. But is it enough to beat the Sigma 35mm f1.4 now that it's been improved with firmware? And what about the Sigma 35 1.2, a lens that you actually can call much bigger and heavier than the others? So let's test all 3 of these out, starting with the difference in size and weight, and move on from there. The Sigma 35mm f1.4 is 665 grams, or about 1.5 pounds, and extends about 5 inches or 12.5 centimeters from the body. I'm used to it now, and I don't mind heavy lenses, but I do find it a bit too long and heavy to balance perfectly on the Sony a7 III. It's only mildly weather sealed, but it does feature a familiar linear focusing ring with window and tactile stops. The Sony 1.8, however, is significantly smaller. It only extends around 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters from the body and weighs less than half that of the Sigma 1.4 at 281 grams or just over half a pound. It definitely achieves a better balance on the a7 III and feels really good in the hand, but I do kind of feel like maybe we went a tad too much in the other direction now, and that this lens could potentially benefit from a little bit of extra length and weight. And its compact size leads to it using a 55mm filter thread, which is significantly less common than the 67mm found on the Sigma 1.4. It has a focus-by-wire system, but it's linear and very responsive and feels surprisingly similar to a mechanical focusing ring. It's well dampened for its size and makes repeatable focus easily achievable. It also has 6 points of weather sealing, which is a huge step up from the Sigma 1.4. The new Sigma f1.2 is also weather sealed though, but it's significantly larger. It's about 1 inch longer than the 1.4 version and weighs over 1,000 grams or just around 2.5 pounds. It has an 82mm filter thread and an aperture ring that can be declicked using a switch along the side. Other controls include the AF/MF selector, which can also be found on the 1.4 version, and a function button that you don't normally see on Sigma lenses. It exists on the Sony 1.8, but it's usually only found on Sony lenses. It also comes with a new hood design, which features a novel, almost silicone-like coating on the bottom edge and push-button release instead of the older twist lock style. The aperture ring is really nice. When in clicked mode, it satisfyingly snaps to every 1/3 of a stop and has the option to remain in A for camera control, and when declicked, it's very smooth and pleasing. The focus ring is also very smooth. They've eliminated the window and the soft stops found on the 1.4 version, but it is extremely well dampened. However, it's not fully linear in its response. The focus throw on this thing is huge. It ranges anywhere between 580 degrees to about 720 degrees. I find that you can turn it over and over and over again just to get the full focus range, but it does seem to be a little bit acceleration based, because if you put a marker on the focus ring and then try to achieve the same focus, it does change the accuracy of it depending on how quickly you turn it. So getting precisely repeatable focus isn't as reliable as with other lenses, but it's better than your typical focus by wire lens, and because of the long throw, you definitely can pull focus to where you want it to stop, but perfectly repeatable might be a little bit of a problem on this lens. It has the same minimum focusing distance as the 1.4, which is 0.3 meters or about 0.99 feet, but the 1.4 has a much shorter throw, albeit it's mechanical, so it's perfectly linear, but it only goes about 90 degrees from infinity to the close focus distance. The Sony 1.8 might be my favorite of the lot, though. It is a focus by wire system with no window or anything, but it's completely linear in its response. And the focus throw is quite a bit longer, too. I think it goes about 150 degrees, so you do get some extra reach there over the 1.4 version. And the minimum focusing distance is actually smaller on this one at 0.22 meters or 0.73 feet. Overall, the construction of the 1.2 is outstanding and rivaling that of a Sony G Master, but of course much bigger. And whenever you start to get into lenses this big and with this size of form factor, you always wonder if the image quality is going to be worth the increase in size and price. For example, in the case of that 40mm Sigma lens that we reviewed not that long ago, which is an absolute behemoth, there was definitely a noticeable improvement in image quality. However, I didn't find that advantage to be as significant on the 35mm 1.2. Yes, it's definitely sharper in the corners, but it's marginal, and I don't think that it's enough to warrant double the price or the huge increase in size. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, let's look at some images here in Lightroom. On the left, we have the 1.2 wide open at 1.2, and on the right, we have the 1.4 wide open at 1.4. And I would say that the sharpness is pretty darn similar when they're center here, probably just a little tiny bit sharper on the 1.2. But if we look over toward the edge, that's when we can start to see a little bit more of the improvement of the 1.2. We can see this is clearly now sharper than the 1.4 is, but it's not a huge difference in my opinion. And if you consider how zoomed in we are, just to be able to see that difference, I don't know if it's going to be worth it to you. There's also a bit more fringing, like if we look up here in the corner, yes, the 1.2 is clearly sharper, and we get more of that sort of purple ghosting happening around the words up here of color checker, and you can see around this little bullseye logo. Or if we look at this line here, we can see that this is a bit sharper of a line, and this one's a little bit softer with a little bit more purple creeping in. And that's pretty much the difference that you're looking at between the 1.2 and the 1.4 when wide open. The difference is a bit more significant when comparing the 1.2 to the 1.8. The 1.8 is probably the worst optical performer when it comes to sharpness of the three lenses, but again, that's to be expected. But again, the differences are actually pretty marginal. Here, have a look. So again, on the left, we have the 1.2 wide open, and on the right, we have the 1.8 wide open. If we look up here at the word color checker, we're getting that same, purple fringing around the edges just like we saw. And if we move over to the edges over here, again, we're going to see a reduction in sharpness. Now, it is a bit worse on the 1.8 than it was on the 1.4, but it's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. And as we move closer toward the center, as you can see down here, it starts to become a lot less apparent. This is the 1.2 and this is the 1.8. And yes, the 1.8 is definitely not as sharp as the 1.2, but even, a quarter of the way more towards the center, it starts to become a pretty insignificant difference in my opinion. And if you look at how small that is in the actual image, it was this tiny little font right there beneath the Polaroid. Are you really going to care about that kind of difference in sharpness in the overall image, especially when usually you're putting your subject closer to the center than you probably would this text over here? But to the 1.2's credit, I should say that even when you stop all the lenses down a little bit, so in this example here, they're both at 2.8, the 1.2 does still maintain its sharpness across the frame. So here is the 1.2 at 2.8 on the left, and here is the 1.4 at 2.8 on the right. And we can see that there's still a disparity in sharpness. Probably the same significance as it was wide open, which again testifies to these lenses that they perform pretty much as well wide open as they do stop down a little bit. But you can still see that the 1.2 is still sharper than the 1.4, even when you stop them both down. And this is also true for the 1.8. And in case you were wondering, here's the difference between the 1.4 and the 1.8, in case those are the two that you were deciding between. This is the 1.4 on the left, and this is the 1.8 at the right. Both stop down to 2.8. I would say that they're pretty darn similar. Let's move over to this here. Again, right at the very edge, the 1.8 does seem to suffer a little bit, where the art lens doesn't seem to have that big of a problem. But, looking up here now that they're stopped down, most of the fringing has been taken care of. And in the center, Slightly worse fringing on the 1.8, but again, pretty much equal sharpness. So the 1.4 and 1.8 when stopped down are pretty darn similar. Wide open, obviously the 1.4 has like 2/3 of a stop advantage, and so at 1.8 it's going to outperform it a little bit, but they're pretty close, just a slight edge to the art lens. Another thing that we should look at while we're in here is the corrective profiles for those that are going to be applying those in Lightroom or whatever raw developer you use. If we enable the profile corrections, this is the 1.8 here, we can see there's actually very little changes being done to distortion. It's mainly just vignetting. And the vignetting is definitely noticeable on the 1.8, but that's impressive how well the distortion's controlled. Now if we switch over to the 1.4 and do the same thing, we can see that there is some distortion being corrected, but less vignetting correction. And then if we go over to the 1.2 and we enable profile corrections, we can see that there's a lot of everything going on. There's a lot of vignetting that needs to be corrected and also quite a bit of distortion. So the worst offender for distortion is definitely the 1.2, then the 1.4, and then the 1.8. And in terms of vignetting, I would say the 1.2 and the 1.8 have probably the most vignetting, and the 1.4 does surprisingly well. However, when it comes to flaring, the opposite is true. It's well controlled by all of these lenses, but the Sigma 1.4 does seem to be the worst offender. I was expecting the 1.2 to show an advantage here, but I was equally impressed by how well the Sony 1.8 performed in this regard. Now all three of these lenses have different maximum apertures. There's a full stop difference between the 1.2 Sigma and the 1.8 Sony, and the Sigma 1.4 comes in 1/3 of a stop slower than the Sigma 1.2 and 2/3 of a stop faster than the Sony 1.8. And this will have two impacts on your shooting. First, if smooth out of focus areas is something that you're going for, then you will see a bit of an advantage moving up to the Sigma 1.2. But it's not a huge improvement over the 1.4. In fact, all three of these lenses produce similarly pleasing bokeh, with minimal cat eyeing and onion ringing. The only real difference is the size of the circles and how important that is to you. But also, if you find yourself shooting at high ISOs a lot, then that extra 2/3 of a stop could make a difference. For instance, if you were using 1.4 lenses on the A7 III and were shooting around ISO 6400, then dropping down to the 1.8 would bump your ISO up to 10,000 to get a similar exposure, and that could definitely add a significant amount more noise to your image. And similarly, moving up to the 1.2 would give you 1/3 of a stop reduction in ISO, which could produce slightly cleaner images. But these three lenses don't seem to transmit equally either. When testing them at equal aperture and ISO and consistent lighting, it would appear that the Sigma 1.2 is a tad darker than the other two, and that the Sigma 1.4 is the brightest. The difference between the 1.4 and the 1.2 was almost 1/3 of a stop better transmission on the 1.4, which in some ways defeats the entire advantage of having the 1.2. The Sigma 1.2 also seems to be a bit more punched in despite equalizing the position. At first I attributed this to focus breathing, but the 1.2 doesn't breathe as badly as the 1.4, and yet it gives a look more like a 37 or 38mm lens, making it somewhat redundant to that terrific 40mm lens that I mentioned earlier. As I was saying though, there's definitely an improvement when it comes to focus breathing on the 1.2 over the 1.4, but the 1.8 is the best here with pretty much no breathing at all. Okay, now let's talk about autofocus. As I was saying before, the Sigma 35mm 1.4 recently got a firmware upgrade to improve its autofocus performance. I did a before and after test of the new firmware, and overall the improvement is noticeable. It's more impactful in some areas than others, but I do find the IAF to be a bit more sticky and reliable now, and the continuous autofocus for video is smoother. In the older firmware, I always felt like the focus happened in stages. There'd be like a major movement and then some more subtle movements, and that doesn't exactly look that great in video. Well, since the firmware update, it appears to have smoothed out some of those movements now, and that transition is a bit more in line with other lenses in terms of setting the AF speed in the camera. Previously, it felt like the Sigmas only had two speeds, really fast and really slow, and that normal medium speed, which is what I would usually use on a Sony lens, just didn't really seem to translate well to the Sigma lenses. Well, I do find that since the firmware upgrade, there is a bit more of that medium speed on the Sigmas now. Still not quite as smooth or as reliable as the Sony 1.8 lens though, which is damn near perfect right out of the box. I first tested this lens at Condo and I was blown away. And then I did a 2-hour talking head continuous AF face tracking test and it never lost focus once, no matter how I turned or moved my body. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Sony lens is using a different internal drive mechanism. It's using a linear drive motor which focuses smoothly forward and backwards inside the lens instead of a rotational focus that you'd find in some of the competition, like some of the Sigma lenses. And overall, this creates a faster, smoother, and definitely quieter autofocus overall. The Sigma 1.2 on the other hand feels like a bit of a step backward. Its video AF is clunky again like the 1.4 used to be, and it makes a lot more noise. I pointed the Deity D3 Pro at each of the lenses as I did an IAF tracking in photo mode, and the only lens that was audible from where I was standing was the 1.2. The 1.4 does make some noise, but you only hear it if you put your ear right up to it, and the 1.8 was absolutely silent. But despite the differences in their method or volume of their autofocus, all three of these lenses feel pretty much instant when it comes to photo focusing, and I can't see you having an issue with any of them. But if perfectly smooth video autofocus transitions are important to you, then the only real option is the Sony 1.8. Face detection in video was a bit more even than I expected it to be. I thought the Sigmas would lag behind pretty badly, but they did quite well. It would appear that they can handle the smaller movements without noticeable issue. It's just the large focus movements that suffer from the choppiness. The Sony 1.8 was a bit more responsive at times, but I think all three are usable for this application. Alright, so now comes the important question. Which lens am I keeping and why? Well, first off, let's eliminate the 1.2. I don't love this lens. The only thing that I can say about it is that it fixes the distagon. It offers all of the same features as the distagon, like the aperture ring and the function button, but without any of the decentering issues. It has an overall sharper image and a better build quality, and it's $100 less at $1,500. So it does that well. It's definitely sharp, and that sharpness carries out all the way to the edge. It just wasn't as impressive as the 40mm. It's not as sharp, doesn't transmit any more light, and is damn near the same focal length anyway. And since the 40mm is $100 cheaper than the 35 1.2, if you're in the market for an optically stunning monster lens, I would get the 40mm. Because in the 35mm department, we have better options. The Sigma 35 1.4, which is now discounted from $900 down to $700, and the Sony 1.8, which is $750. Because the Sigma 1.4 is now $50 cheaper than the Sony, it's probably still the best compromise lens, and I can still definitely recommend it. It offers slightly better image quality than the Sony, 2/3 of a stop more light, and it keeps up in the photo department. But when I think about what you're getting in return from the Sony for giving up that extra light and sharpness, you get weather sealing, which along with its compact size make this a more versatile lens, and you pretty much eliminate the focus breathing. And I'm okay with giving up that 2/3 of a stop because I find that I often shoot around f1.8 or f2 anyway, and I rarely have my ISO up high enough that a larger aperture would make that profound of a difference on noise. Plus you get a longer and smoother focus throw for manual focusing on the Sony, and a shorter close focusing distance. And you get a focus motor that works wonderfully for autofocus transitions in video. And isn't that a big part of the appeal of using a Sony camera? So for me, I'm willing to spend the extra $50 and go with the Sony 1.8, my new favorite 35mm lens for E-mount. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.